All right, let's talk about section 19.3, which talks about Earth's, a little bit about Earth's early history and then the origins of life. So, um, the universe as a whole is very old, something like 15 billion years old. Our solar system is around 5 billion years old. And Earth, as you can see, is about a little over 4.5 billion years old. That's when it first started forming. Of course, it was a very inhospitable place at first. Um, at the very beginning, just sort of this molten mass of extremely hot semi-solid rock. But as it cooled, an atmosphere began to form and cooled enough for water vapor to condense into liquid, and then you got liquid water on the surface of the Earth. The oceans formed essentially. Um, and here's sort of an artist's rendering. And take note of these sort of round blobby things sort of at the edge of the water here. We're going to get back to these. These are structures that you still find on Earth today that are thought to be structures formed by some of the first living things. Um, okay, so the early atmosphere was not at all like it is now. There was nitrogen gas, water vapor, CO2. These were the main gases. Now, those are not terribly unusual gases, but you'll notice that there's something in particular that's missing that is present now in the atmosphere, but was not present then, and that would be free oxygen, O2. There was none of that, as far as we can tell, at the beginning. Um, and like I said, the Earth, a lot of it was water vapor, but as the Earth cooled, that water vapor condensed, and you got the formation of the Earth's oceans. So here's another graphic showing that, again, early on, a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, a little bit of methane, and a lot of nitrogen, but no oxygen. Also, perhaps to a lesser extent, you had some carbon monoxide, some hydrogen sulfide, and some hydrogen cyanide. So indeed, the Earth's atmosphere and the early Earth was not terribly hospitable to living things, particularly life as we know it today. Um, so it was an Earth which consisted of fairly simple molecules in the atmosphere, as you can see, and in particular, there were not really complex organic molecules, the kinds that we think of today, like carbohydrates and proteins and lipids and nucleic acids. Those were not around as far as we can tell. Now, so the question is, where did these larger organic molecules come from? Um, well, they essentially came through a process we could describe as chemical evolution, going from relatively simple molecules to more complex molecules, and in particular what we sometimes describe as inorganic molecules to organic. Um, so there's a very famous experiment done back in I think the late 1950s called the Miller experiment. And Stanley Miller at the University of Chicago, he and an assistant, well, his graduate advisor basically, whose name was Harold Urey. So they're sometimes known as the Miller-Urey experiments. And in fact, Miller, I believe, was a graduate student at the time. Um, they were trying to figure out, okay, what were the conditions, if we could try to simulate the conditions of the early Earth and the compounds that were there, could we get simple molecules to form more complex molecules? And so what they did was in a sterile environment, they heated up some water, um, got some water vapor generated. They added some of the compounds that they thought may have been present then. Here you can see methane, ammonia, and hydrogen gas combined with water vapor, so at a high temperature. They provided an electric shock to the system, And then what they did was they recondensed the vapor. They basically reliquefied it. And they collected this liquid. Um, and they let this cook for quite a while, but then again collected some of the liquid and they analyzed it. And what they found was they were able to generate some amino acids. You'll recall that amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and so they were able to generate, excuse me, from these simple molecules more complex, these simple inorganic molecules, more complex organic molecules. Essentially, things that could be described as the building blocks of life. Okay, so this was an important demonstration. Now, you'll notice that what we said existed in the Earth's atmosphere is not what they used, but again, this was back in the 50s when they thought these things exist in the atmosphere, but subsequent recreations of the Miller experiment using different combinations of things and what we now think of as the Earth's early atmosphere allows people to still generate organic molecules. All right, so you have the building blocks of life, but where does the first living thing come from? Well, some of these types of organic molecules you build, like proteins and also lipids, when they're in a water-based solution, an aqueous solution, they will self-assemble into these balls or these microspheres. All right, and so these microspheres sort of create this barrier between the inside of this sphere and the outside. And these things can start to demonstrate some of the properties of life, so we could perhaps describe them as protocells or some of the first cells. And it's thought that this was happening, some of these first cell-like structures were forming about 3.8 billion years ago. Um, and so, as you recall, I'm sure from first semester, membranes are made of these types of lipids called phospholipids, and they will self-assemble into a bilayer, a double layer of the lipids between the inside of this ball or this protocell and the outside. Um, and as we learn then, they of course can be a selective barrier or a selective membrane, so some things can get across easily and others can't. So now you've got this membrane, if you will, this structure. And how do we get to some cell-like properties? Well, what you need is the generation or the situation in which you have how I like to describe it is sort of a unique kind of chemistry going on inside that cell. Essentially a primitive type of metabolism. That is, you have molecules present inside the cell that may not be present on the outside, and doing things, carrying out reactions inside of the cell that are this protocell that are unique to that cell. All right, so of course you can have proteins present inside them, and we know that some proteins act as enzymes. They start to facilitate reactions. One of the next questions is, so you might have some proteins in here. One of the next questions is, okay, what about, we know that cells have hereditary material, DNA basically, that they pass on to their offspring, or when the cell divides, that you make copies of it. Each new cell gets copies of the DNA. Well, how did that come about? Well, it's thought, and this is stuff that's still being researched quite a bit, but it's thought that RNA was probably the first nucleic acid, the first hereditary material present. It's thought that because RNA is a bit more simple molecule than DNA, and it's a more functional molecule. DNA doesn't really do a whole lot other than just embody the hereditary material, but RNA can have enzymatic properties. It can basically copy itself. Okay, and these are things that DNA really can't do. So inside of our protocell, again, presumably we think that RNA was the first hereditary material. You got these proteins present, and as you recall, you can use RNA as a template to make proteins. So you've got your simple metabolism, and so what's another characteristic of life, if you can recall? Of course, the ability to reproduce is important. And so when this simple protocell begins to split into two separate balls, each sharing the same unique chemistry, you might be able to say it is now reproduced. So essentially on this early Earth, there would have been, again, a lot of this chemical evolution going on, a lot of different molecules being formed, different combinations of them. Some combinations didn't really work together or weren't stable. They would break apart, but other combinations were more stable and they persisted. They could split into two and have a simple kind of reproduction. They had unique chemistry inside of them, a simple metabolism. So now they start to demonstrate some of the characteristics of life. And we can say at that point we have our first cells, prokaryotic cells, essentially bacteria. Again, there is no oxygen present, no free oxygen present, so it's an anaerobic world. They would have been anaerobic bacteria. They did not make use of oxygen. They did not do cellular respiration. They would have just essentially done a version of fermentation, most likely. All right, but then, again, so that was about 3.8 billion years ago. From evidence in the geologic record, we think that about 2.5 billion years ago was another major step in the development of life. That is the development of photosynthesis. Some of these bacteria started to make use of sunlight as a source of energy to make food, and particularly stromatolites that I mentioned are these rock-like structures that build up over time from layers of these cyanobacteria just accumulating, and you find them off the coast of Australia primarily in relatively shallow water, you can see here. So these cyanobacteria started to pump out all sorts of oxygen, and that's when the oxygen levels in the atmosphere started to increase dramatically. And so now we've got all this oxygen, and we have a shift towards an aerobic world. Bacteria developed the ability to do cellular respiration, to be able to make use of oxygen to more efficiently process their food compared to anaerobic organisms. Now, of course, those are, as we say, the first ones were prokaryotic, these relatively simple cells, but it's about 2 billion years ago when we see the first eukaryotic cells. That's cells which have more complex structure and nucleus and all that kind of stuff. These first eukaryotes came about through a process known as the endosymbiotic theory, which I'll talk about more in class, proposed by this woman named Lynn Margulis. I'll show you a book she wrote about this. And so essentially some of these early prokaryotes essentially started to develop at first a more complex membrane system. That is, their outer membrane began to fold, make these inner folds to increase the surface area of that membrane. And when you had more of that membrane surface area, it allowed them to do things like cellular respiration more efficiently. Some of these assembled into presumably a nucleus, an area to protect the hereditary material. And then the process of endosymbiosis. Other prokaryotes were taken in, and instead of being taken in and consumed as they might have been normally, they became part of this new organism. The cells merged, you might say, and so it's pretty generally accepted that things like mitochondria and chloroplasts developed through this endosymbiotic theory. They were once free-living bacteria that were engulfed in other bacteria, developing into what we would call a eukaryote. All right, two more things talked about in this section are where did sexual reproduction come from and why do organisms do it, and multicellularity. I'm running out of time on the video, but we'll discuss that in class, essentially the advantages of each type of reproduction and why sexual reproduction is so common now. Okay, that's it.